Hello and welcome to the Regenagri podcast, the go-to place to hear everything about regenerative agriculture. Regenagri is an initiative supporting farms, agribusinesses and the supply chain in their transition to regenerative approaches. We offer global capability with the aim of securing the health of the land and the wealth of those who live on it. For more information about our initiative and to find out how we can help you with your regenerative journey, visit regenagri.org. I'm your host, Rose Riley, and once again, I'm excited to bring you the latest developments on the global phenomenon that is regenerative agriculture. For this episode, we're going to be exploring how the way food is produced impacts its nutritional content and flavour. We'll ask whether regeneratively produced food can claim to be more nutritious and tastier and delve into the evidence behind this. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by David Montgomery, a professor of Earth and Space Sciences at the University of Washington and co-author of the recently launched book, What Your Food Ate. Through his work, David has compared the soil health and nutritional density of crops coming from regenerative farms to their non-regenerative neighbours. Thank you for joining me today, David. It's great to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So to begin with, I'd love for you to explain what led you to research the nutritional content of regenerative versus conventionally produced crops.
Well, it's been actually kind of a long road. My background is in geology, so I come at this literally from the ground up and looking at crops, thinking about how it is we grow our food influences what gets into it. But that's not the first question I started asking when I started looking into soils. My training as a geologist is in the kind of geology that looks at what shapes the surface of the earth. So soil erosion is really when I first started paying attention to soil, from investigating all around the world the natural processes that shape landscapes. Technically, I'm a geomorphologist, someone who studies the surface forms of the earth. And when you do that, you look at soils, you start paying attention to soils. And one of the things I noticed years and years ago was that in various regions around the world where I was working on soil erosion problems and land sculpting, that the regions where the soil had been eroded off, where the land had been really degraded, the human populations in those regions were very impoverished. There seemed to be a connection between the state of the land and the state of societies at large. And that got me into looking at the backstory and history of land degradation and soil erosion through humanity's broad history of agriculture. And I wrote a book called Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations that looked into those connections. And what I looked at was how farming practices through centuries and millennia had resulted in soil loss, but also degradation of soil organic matter, degradation of soil carbon. And that sort of opened questions into, okay, well, how might we reverse this historical degradation of what to date has amounted to about a third of the world's potential farmland has been degraded enough that it's out of agricultural production. And that, is clearly not in humanity's long-term best interest. So how might we restore fertility to land is a question that my wife, Anne Biklé, and I started wrestling with when we wrote The Hidden Half of Nature, and then I wrote Growing a Revolution, two subsequent books to the Dirt book that looked at how microbial life, the bacteria and fungi in the soil, are actually really essential to building and maintaining soil fertility, and how farmers doing regenerative agriculture around the world could actually use practices that rebuild the health and fertility of their land to put carbon back in the ground, to reduce their dependence on agrochemicals, and to enhance the profitability of their farms. So after we wrote, Dirt, the Hidden Half and Growing a Revolution, a question that was still on the table was the one that you just asked me, which is, what is the connection between soil health and human health? How does the way that we farm actually influence what gets into our food? And what might that do? What has that done? And what might that do to our human health on an individual level going forward? So I've been looking at the connections between soil health and human health at a societal level for a while. And the most recent book, What Your Food Ate, really gets into looking at the connections between farming practices, what that does to the health of the soil, what the health of the soil does to the health of the crops that are grown in that soil, what the health of the soil and the health of crops does for animal health, livestock health for those organisms that are grazing or eating agricultural products, and finally, how it all rolls up and integrates into human health. And so that's the deep dive that Anne and I took in the most recent book. So it's kind of an interesting story in terms of how I got there. And it turns out, as a biologist, I'm a geologist. And when you combine those two fields, you're really looking at soil. It's the interface between the dead world of geology and the living world of biology. And how the way that we treat farmland affects the health of the soil turns out to integrate up into things that really matter for human health, particularly in terms of trying to prevent or treat chronic diseases through the style of the food that we eat. And so that's the sort of the backstory in terms of how we started looking into all that, and it's been a lot of fun to dig into what is happening in terms of how regenerative agriculture could potentially be a solution, not only for land degradation, but also how it could help bolster human health going forward through growing more healthful foods.
Fantastic, thank you. We'll dig more into the links that you've found between growing techniques and nutrition and health more in a minute. But before we do, regenerative can be quite a controversial term, quite a broad term with different interpretations. So I'm keen to know from your perspective what it means.
Yeah, there's a lot of arguments today about what it means, what it should mean, what it could mean, and lots of people bring their own definitions to the table. The one that I like to think about, and when I think about regenerative farming in the big picture terms that I tend to think of as a geologist, is that it's an umbrella term that covers farming practices that build and maintain the health and fertility of the soil as a consequence of intensive farming, which means that it's very different than conventional farming, which has degraded land around the world. And it's an umbrella that could cover things as diverse as biodynamic agriculture and agroforestry and different elements of what I came to call organic-ish agriculture in growing a revolution of conventional farmers who'd weaned themselves almost, but not completely off of agrochemicals, or organic farmers that are starting to minimize the tillage that they use in their systems and thereby improve the health of their land. So I tend to view soil health as the integrating goal of regenerative farming, but that there's lots of different paths to it in terms of how to actually get there. So if you take soil health as the North Star of farming practices, those that move towards building and maintaining that, I would consider to be under a regenerative umbrella. Now, in terms of certifications and arguments that people will have in terms of what specifically should and should not be incorporated in the term, I think people are going to argue that for a fair while because that's what people do. But there was an interesting academic paper published, I think it was in 2021, just last year, that looked at what people in the journals have been using the word regenerative for when they refer to agriculture. And again, there were multiple definitions that people used, but the common element, the commonality, was soil health. And that's sort of where I sort of start in thinking about that. And I think that's a pretty good definition because when we look at agricultural practices writ broadly around the world, there's so many different climates and soil types and, technology levels available to farmers and markets to sell into and crops that can actually be sold or that won't sell, that a diversity of methods are going to be, central. The context is really important to figure out how to do regenerative farming on any one piece of land. We spent most of the 20th century trying to get our agricultural land around the world to basically produce under a system of farming that we imported and brought in and imposed our way of doing things on the land. And we kind of lost some sense of context. And I think that context is actually really important for thinking about with regenerative practices because not every corner of every farm is the same. They need to be treated a little different. If the goal is to cultivate and foster the beneficial life in the soil, to rebuild soil fertility and rebuild soil organic matter, enhance productivity, and minimize the need for external inputs, that's going to require some tailoring to the landscape and to tailoring to the technology that farmers in different parts of the world have available. But there's some general principles that can guide it that I think are robust and universal. But the practices are going to be different in different areas around the world.
So going back to your book, What Your Food Ate, and the studies that you've done, how did you actually investigate the nutritional density of regenerative crops and livestock?
Well, we did a couple things. Anne and I are big history buffs, and so one of the things we did is we went back and read a whole lot of papers back to the 1920s and 30s. And if you want to spend a few weeks of just nerdly bliss, go back and read old journal papers for a few weeks and see what people knew 100 years ago. When you're a writer, it's actually useful because you can get a perspective on, well, where have we been thinking? What did we know a while ago? How has the field progressed and advanced and changed? And there were some people in the 20s and 30s who were very interested in the potential effects of a new style of farming, what we now call conventional farming, sort of tillage and fertilizer rich farming practices, the backbone of modern industrial agriculture. There were people in the 20s and 30s who were concerned about what that might be doing to the nutritional quality of our foods. They mostly focused on the newly discovered vitamins and a little bit on minerals in terms of how they get into food. And they did studies on rats. They did studies on changing the foods of kids at boarding schools. There was a whole slew of interesting experiments you can go back and look at. So we looked at those kind of historical things, not only for their scientific insight, but also just insight in the way thinking has evolved and the way people have been looking at stuff. We then reviewed a lot of studies from the 40s and 50s that looked at similar kinds of questions and integrated that up, right to the most recent journal articles we could find. So we dug deep into the scientific literature. There's a source document that accompanies What Your Food Ate that has 1,000 references in it that are the sources that we actually read for the book. So, there's a big heavy lift in terms of looking at what has been known, what has been looked at, what has been known about the way farming practices impact soil health, and how what, if anything, does that do to what gets into our food? And, since we finished the book and I'm talking about it, you probably are guessing that, yes, there was stuff that we found that looked like there were effects, but it was very interesting. Now, in terms of the regenerative component, the term that you were asking me to help define a few minutes ago is a fairly new one. So there's not a lot of scientific literature that has specifically addressed what do regenerative practices do to the nutritional components in our food. And that was actually one of the big sort of studies that when Anne and I were researching the book, we wanted to find. We didn't want to have to do the study ourselves. It's much easier when other people have done the work and you can report on it rather than having to do the science from scratch. But we ended up doing some testing ourselves because we couldn't find the study where people looked at regenerative versus conventional practices side by side. There were lots of studies on comparing organic and conventional farming practices, and when we reviewed that literature, we came away with the conclusion that what's consistently different between conventional and organic foods is, obviously the pesticide level. Conventional foods have more pesticides. They have more heavy metals. There's no mystery there as to why. Whether or not that's a significant issue, I'll leave on the table for the moment. Lots of people like to argue about that, but there's no doubt that conventional produce has more of those things in them, and that we don't want them in our food, even at low levels, although opinions differ as to how much to be concerned about that.
Yep.
The other thing we found was that micronutrients, mineral micronutrients and vitamins tended to be higher in organic foods. And consistently across the board, things known as phytochemicals were consistently always higher in the comparisons of organic and conventional foods. And what are phytochemicals? They are chemical, it's hidden right there in the name, chemicals that plants make. Phyto is plant, chemicals, chemical. So they used to be called secondary compounds. And people wondered, why are plants making these things? But they make them for their own defense. They make them for communication purposes. They make them for nutritional purposes. There's a whole bunch of botanical reasons plants make them. But when they end up in our diet, they end up serving roles as antioxidants and anti-inflammatories, things that are actually beneficial for maintaining our health. So there are consistently higher levels of those in organic foods than conventional. And that's about what we could take away from that whole decades of literature comparing those things. It's a more murkier conclusions when you look at what happens to the macronutrients, things just like protein or major element components. And when you think about that, the major element chemistry of a tomato is probably dictated by the genes of a tomato and how it puts itself together, whereas farming practices are influencing how much lycopene is in it, for example, a phytochemical that has demonstrated anti-cancer properties and antioxidant effects, if I'm remembering right. We then sort of are left with the question of, okay, well, what about regenerative practices? Because they're not necessarily identical to organic practices. You can think of organic, regenerative, and conventional as three different labels in agriculture, where conventional permits the use of a whole lot of chemicals that are not permitted in organic, and organic is in effect defined by what you're not allowed to do, whereas regenerative is defined in the way we're talking about it as things that build soil health. So there's three different ways to go about thinking about it. And we couldn't find studies that connected compared regenerative and conventional. So Anne and I did a little 10 paired farm comparison across the United States with Ray Archuleta, a colleague that retired from the U.S. DA Natural Resource Conservation Service as senior soil scientist there, and a pair of farmers that we worked with as well to look at what are the differences in soil health and in the nutrient density of crops grown on these paired regenerative and conventional farms. So we picked 10 paired farms where we had them grow the same crop on the same soil type, in the same climate in the same year with pretty much neighboring farms, and we measured the soil health parameters on those farms, and then compared the ratios for each pairing across the country. And what we found is that on average, the regenerative farms that had been doing a combination of no-till, cover crops, and growing diverse crop rotations for between 5 and 10 years, they had twice the organic matter in their topsoil, and 3 times higher soil health scores, measured with the Haney soil health score test for folks who may know what that is. The point being is that the topsoil, the uppermost level where most of the fertility in the land is held, was a lot better on the regenerative farms. We also found that in terms of the crops that were grown on it, with a limited sample, small sample sizes, so we labeled the study a preliminary study because that's really what it is. But we found higher levels of phytochemicals, so 20% to 25%, if I'm recalling right, higher levels of the phytochemicals we tested for in those different crops, higher levels up to 34% higher levels of certain vitamins in the vitamin comparison. Minerals were kind of all over the map for this comparison across the U.S. But we basically found things that the regenerative crops had a better profile in terms of the micronutrients and phytochemicals in the same way that the organic crops did in terms of the comparison with conventional. And why might that be? We think it's due to the effects on soil life and soil health. With healthier soils, with better communities of beneficial microbes in the soil, bacteria and fungi, they can actually facilitate the uptake of mineral nutrients, the production of and uptake of vitamins, and the provisioning of phytochemicals in crops. So we think that the evidence is pointing to the idea that soil health is actually beneficial to those nutritional components of human health in our diet. But there's one wrinkle there, is when you look at the nutritional sciences and their definitions of what defines a nutrient, phytochemicals are typically not on the list of things that are considered nutrients, even though they actually benefit human health. We don't need them for our survival, and so we can do okay without them, but it seems we do better with them, or we do better with more of them.
Absolutely incredible. Have you found any links between health of the soil and the flavour of food?
That's a really interesting question. There's a few studies. When you're starting to connect farming practices to soil health, to crop health, to animal health, to human health, there's an awful lot of dots in between to connect. Right? There's a whole lot of disciplines you have to sample from and span to even start thinking about those connections. So it's very rare to find studies that would look at the direct connection all the way from the soil to human health, let alone flavor. But when you break it into individual pieces, you can put them together like beads on a string and start out with soil health and end up over at human health and flavor with pretty solid science connecting stuff all the way. And with the flavor end of things in particular, there are some interesting studies that have been done. Not many, but some that are very interesting. Particularly one that Anne actually originally brought to my attention in terms of colleagues in Florida who had done tests on looking at different cultivars, different varieties of tomatoes. And they were trying to figure out, okay, well, why do people like certain kinds of tomatoes better than others? We all know of that, flavorless cardboard tomato you can occasionally find in the grocery store or in something you get at a restaurant where you go, it doesn't even taste like a tomato. Or alternatively, those, some wonderful heirloom tomato you've had perhaps at a high-end restaurant or that a friend grew in the yard that you go, wow, that just tastes so good.
Yep.
What's driving that? It was what's motivating this test. And what they found is that they basically did taste tests on a few different cultivars and found that in this one comparison that the tomatoes that people universally pretty much preferred had higher. They then analyzed the composition of what was in those tomatoes to see what was making the flavors, and there were higher levels of carotenoids, a phytochemical, higher levels of certain essential amino acids, and higher levels of certain fatty acids, omega-3 fats in particular. And those three things are all things that we know farming practices, through other studies, can influence their content in foods and fruits and vegetables in particular. And in this one comparison of tomatoes, the tomatoes that are actually richer in compounds that are really quite beneficial to human health in terms of antioxidants, anti-inflammatories, or essential amino acids and essential fats, were the ones that were the preferred flavors. So it suggests that there's this concept that Fred Provenza really pioneered called body wisdom, which is looking at how livestock choose what to eat and how they kind of can navigate a diet of different plants to get what their bodies need through the flavors that they're ingesting, sending signals to their brain about whether I want this or I want that. Turns out our bodies can do the same thing. And, we know that a lot of our experience in taste is through smells that come along with it. And a lot of the precursor molecules to appealing aromas turn out to be rooted in compounds that have beneficial human health effects, things like essential fats, essential amino acids, and various phytochemicals. And it turns out our bodies have taste receptors throughout organs throughout our body. We like to think of taste as something that happens in our mouth. That's where we know and we experience it. But other parts of our body are actually communicating with taste receptors about what's going into our bodies in a way that is providing us information about what's in our food filtered through flavor. So when you look at sort of whole natural foods, the ones that tend to taste better probably are better for you. And we all have our own sort of quirks of tastes and desires. I had a meal the other day where Anne loved it, and there was some flavor in it that just was wrong for me. Not that that was not healthy for me, but there's something about the way my mouth is wired didn't like that. But there is an underlying circuitry in our bodies that helps to connect the nutritional component of what's coming in to telling our brain, whether we should want more or less of that. And there's studies that have looked at how that translates into satiety, sort of satisfaction when you stop eating. That if you're getting the signals through what you're eating that they're full of nutrients, you will tend to eat less of them than if you're not getting those same kind of signals. And so you might think about, well, what did the food processing industry do to flavors, in the last 40 or 50 years by breaking foods into their components and then re-engineering them in ways where that link between flavor and nutrition has been broken. That link between flavor and nutrition is probably best thought of as something that is inherent in whole natural foods. Once you get into really processed foods, flavor is not a guide to nutrition. I mean, that's why I love barbecued potato chips, right? I'm not pretending they're any good for me, but I love the flavor.
A very broad question now. What do you think needs to change in order for the food systems that we have across the world to provide access to both nutritious and flavorful food for our increasingly enormous population, whilst ideally also restoring our damaged soils?
Well, that's a very big open-ended question that
it is,
you
yes.
probably talk about for a few years in a graduate seminar. But, I think at the root level, we need a new philosophy of agriculture. We need a very different opinion or a very different way to frame how we treat the land in growing our food. And we need to view farming as essentially the first line of defense in medicine and in public health in terms of thinking about how we connect the dots between the way we grow food and how we eat and maintaining our own health. We've treated the soil for the last 100 years in agriculture as a medium to hold up the plants as we add the agrochemicals to grow abundant harvests. And there's nothing wrong with trying to feed the world. But what I think we need to do is to reframe and adopt a new agricultural philosophy focused around maintaining the health of the soil and trying to nourish the world beyond simply feeding the world, beyond the provisioning of calories to the provisioning of nutrient-dense calories so that people can eat less but be better nourished in the developed world and eat more and healthily in the global south.
So following on from that, is it possible, in your opinion, for farmers to produce enough nutrient-dense food for the global population? Do we have the capability to have both the quality and the quantity that we need when it comes to food?
Yeah, I think the choice between quantity and quality is a false dichotomy. We spent most of the last 100 years breeding crops for high yields, high performance in high nitrogen environments without paying much attention to the consequences and declining mineral and vitamin and phytochemical content of those foods, whether in grains, our staple crops, or in fruits and vegetables. But it turns out that a lot of the genetics for crops would lend themselves for breeding for both high yield and high nutrition if we simply bred for them. So we haven't been doing it, so we're 80 years behind the curve, in effect, on the nutrition end and the micronutrient end of things. We've been focusing almost exclusively on yields rather than trying to optimize both. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for making great headway there. And a lot of my opinion in that regard is centered around the experiences I had in interviewing farmers for writing Growing a Revolution, where I visited regenerative farmers around the world who had already done the great heavy lifting of restoring soils on their farms and turning fairly degraded land into very productive land. And their yields, their output, was generally outproducing their conventional neighbors. Now, they'd gone through the process of restoring their land, and there is a transition, and you take a yield. If you go straight from agrochemically intensive agriculture to regenerative ag, and you just start straight out of the gate, your yields will take a hit before you then rebuild the fertility of the land. But I was impressed by how short the time lag was for actually getting through that process and getting to the point where these more regenerative practices can be competitive on a yield basis, as well as being a better than competitive, I think, on a nutritional basis. But what really turned me into an optimist on how much of this could actually take root, shall we say, in the next few decades, was how that resulted in more profitable farms for farmers, whether it was on small subsistence farms in Africa I visited or some of the very large, very mechanized, industrialized North American farms I visited. If you're able to spend less on fertilizer, spend less on diesel because you're not plowing as much, spend less on pesticides or patented seeds because you don't need them as much, and yet you're able to maintain harvests, that's a recipe for a more profitable farm. And I saw the example of farmers who had been early adopters who had figured out, had stumbled through the errors that inevitably occur as you try and figure out a new system of doing something. That once they'd gotten through that and they had a system that would work in a region for the crops they wanted to grow, it could actually be adopted by new farmers fairly rapidly in a way that would have much less risk than the initial pioneers were adopting as they slowly went from no-till to cover crops to diversity. If you adopt all three all at once, you can accelerate the process. And of course, reintegrating animal husbandry on into farming operations can act as an accelerant for rebuilding soil fertility if it's done following regenerative protocols.
And so to wrap up, I wonder if you've got a piece of advice that you might give to somebody who shares your passion for food and nutrition and regenerative farming.
I'll offer two pieces of advice. One would be to any farmers who are thinking about going the regenerative route. I'd encourage you to tinker. Do an experiment with a corner of your farm. Start off with a little bit and see whether you like what it's doing to your soil before you sort of jump in whole hog if you're at all concerned or worried about the transition. I think how to think through risk minimization is actually a really big and important element for people adopting regenerative practices. And to seek out farmers in your region or advice from experts in your region of people who've already done it with the kinds of crops you want to grow in the region you want to do it, and then start tinkering and experimenting. Because all the farmers I met who were very successful at adopting regenerative practices to not only heal their land but improve their bottom line, they were people who tinkered and were experimenting. They were thinking about what they were doing and challenging themselves a little bit. And at the other end, at the consumer end of things, I guess the best advice I can give at present is that until some of the supply chain and certification and labeling things become more mainstream in terms of being able to identify specific regeneratively grown things at a grocery store, my best advice is to try and visit farmers markets and get to know the farmers who are growing your food. That's what Anne and I have done here in Seattle, where fortunately we have wonderful regional farmers, wonderful farmers markets in town. We're able to actually talk to farmers and buy from people who we like what they're doing to their land. We know how our meat and dairy is raised. We know how our vegetables are being raised. And we think it's made a difference. And that also ends up supporting regenerative farmers as well. If you're interested in trying to see the idea of more environmentally friendly regenerative farming going forward, we need to support them at all levels. And then, of course, for large companies, if you want a more secure supply chain, I think regenerative farming is actually a better way to go in a world that's fast approaching the end of the fossil fuel era. And if you're in government and a decision maker, we need to start thinking about farming practices and agricultural policy as health policy, because if we were actually be able to reframe agriculture around a more regenerative framework and have a higher quality food supply for our publics, we ought to be able to recoup substantial savings in healthcare down the road.
Fantastic. David, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and really fascinating hearing you talk about the link between soil health, nutrition, and human health.
No worries. It's a pleasure to talk to you. And obviously, I recommend What Your Food Ate to anybody who's interested in following up on this. There's a lot more in there than we could talk about today. But I appreciate the opportunity to chat.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today for the Regenagri podcast. Some great food for thought. To learn more about what we've talked about in this episode, please find the links in the show notes. David's most recent book, What Your Food Ate, can be found via most online bookstores. If you would like to know more about how the Regenagri initiative can help you on your regenerative journey, from advisory services, monitoring of on-farm data, and regenerative certification, through to carbon verification, please visit regenagri.org. There, you can also check out our case studies and articles and gain access to our digital hub for free insight and advice. Alternatively, follow us on Twitter at regenagri_org or search Regenagri on LinkedIn.